Chapter 1. The Mirror's Whisper. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, voices overlapping, the faint scent of street food wafting through the air. Yet, amidst the chaos, John felt an overwhelming sense of stillness. His mind was blank, his inspiration drained. He walked aimlessly, hands buried in his coat pockets, head heavy with frustration. For weeks, he had struggled with his art. Each time he picked up a brush, his hands hesitated. His paintings lacked life, and every attempt to create something meaningful ended in frustration. It wasn't just a creative block, it was as if something had sucked the passion right out of him. Maybe he wasn't meant to be an artist. The thought gnawed at him like a parasite. What if he had already peaked? What if his best work was behind him? He exhaled sharply, shaking the thought away. No. He needed inspiration, something new, something different. That was when he saw it. Nestled between two towering buildings was a small, forgotten antique shop. The wooden sign above the door was faded, its letters barely legible. Dust covered the glass windows, and behind them, relics of the past lay in disarray, old books, strange sculptures, and things that seemed to belong to another world. John had walked this street countless times before, yet he had never noticed the shop. Something about it pulled at him. He stepped inside. A soft chime rang as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The scent of aged paper, worn leather, and something faintly metallic filled the air. Dim lights flickered from an old chandelier, casting long shadows across the cramped space. Every inch of the shop was cluttered with forgotten objects, some delicate, others unsettling. Behind the counter sat an old man with piercing eyes, his weathered face unreadable. He looked up as John entered, his gaze sharp. Looking for something, the old man asked, voice low and knowing. John hesitated. I don't know. The old man smiled faintly. Sometimes, the right thing finds you. John wandered deeper into the shop, his fingers brushing over dust-covered books, rusted pocket watches, and delicate porcelain figures. Nothing truly caught his eye until he saw it. Half covered by a moth-eaten cloth, leaning against the farthest wall, was a mirror. Its frame was unlike anything he had ever seen, deep, polished wood, carved with intricate swirling patterns that seemed almost alive. The glass was pristine, untouched by time or dust, reflecting the dim light with an unsettling clarity. John took a step closer. His pulse quickened. Something about the mirror felt wrong. That one, the old man murmured behind him, making John flinch. He hadn't heard him move. Where did it come from? John asked, unable to tear his eyes away from his own reflection. The old man was silent for a moment. It's been here a long time. John ran his fingers along the frame. The carvings were strange, almost like a forgotten language. How much? He asked. The old man studied him for a long moment before saying, for you, just take it. John blinked. What? Call it a gift? That should have been a warning. Nothing valuable came without a price. And yet, John ignored the uneasy feeling in his chest. He lifted the mirror carefully, surprised by how cold the wood felt beneath his fingertips. A strange chill ran through his arms, but he shook it off. The bell above the door chimed again as he stepped back onto the bustling street, the mirror clutched tightly in his grasp. Back in his apartment, John set the mirror against the wall of his studio. His space was cluttered, paintbrushes, canvases, half-finished sketches strewn across the floor. But the moment he placed the mirror down, everything else seemed to fade. He stepped back, studying it. The golden glow of the city outside reflected in the glass, creating a mesmerizing effect. For the first time in weeks, inspiration struck. John grabbed his sketchpad, his hands moving on their own. The frame's swirling patterns became his focus, his pencil capturing the eerie beauty of the carvings. Time slipped away unnoticed. But then, a shiver ran down his spine. His reflection was watching him. John frowned. He turned his head slightly. His reflection mimicked him. And yet, something was off. The room behind him in the mirror seemed darker. The shadows stretched too long, their edges too sharp. He leaned closer. His reflection did the same. And then, it didn't. John's breath caught in his throat. For a fraction of a second, his reflection remained still, even after he had moved. A slow, sickening realization crept over him. This wasn't just a mirror. His reflection wasn't just a reflection. He took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation. He was exhausted, sleep-deprived, his imagination playing tricks on him. Yes. That had to be it. He forced a laugh. "I need sleep," he muttered. But as he turned away, he failed to see his reflection watching him. Long after he had looked away. That night, John dreamt of shadows. In his dream, he stood before the mirror, unable to move, unable to look away. A whisper slithered through the air, curling around his ears like a breath against his skin. The words were unintelligible, but the voice was his own. He woke with a start, heart hammering against his ribs. The room was dark, but the mirror glowed. A cold sweat broke over his skin. His breath came fast and shallow. The rational part of his mind told him it was just the way the city lights bounced off the glass, but another part of him, a deeper, older part of him, told him to get rid of it. To run. John sat up, rubbing his face. He was overreacting. It was just a mirror. And yet, as he lay back down, his pulse refused to settle. Because he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. That something inside the mirror was watching. Waiting. And in the silence of his apartment, with only the soft hum of the city outside, he swore he heard it again. A whisper. His name. Chapter 2. The shadow in the glass. John woke to the sound of knocking. At first, it blended into his dream, a rhythmic tap, 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 like rain against glass. But as his mind surfaced from sleep, he realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his apartment. His breath hitched. He turned his head slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The mirror. The knocking was coming from the mirror. John sat up too fast, his vision swimming. His bedroom was shrouded in darkness, save for the dim glow of the streetlights seeping through the curtains. He reached for his phone and checked the time. 3:33 a.m. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. John exhaled shakily, running a hand down his face. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him. The stress of work, the loneliness, the late-night horror movies, maybe it all conspired to mess with his head. He lay back down, pulling the sheets over himself. Then, just as his eyes fluttered shut. Knock. 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 A cold dread slithered down his spine. His gaze darted toward the mirror. From his bed, he could see its ornate frame catching faint slivers of light. But the glass itself looked darker than before. Like it was absorbing the shadows rather than reflecting them. John swallowed hard. Just my imagination, he muttered. I'm overthinking this. But something about the mirror unsettled him. The way it stood there, old and imposing, as if it had a presence of its own. He had never felt this way about any object before. After a few minutes, the knocking didn't return. His exhaustion took over, dragging him back into sleep. The next morning, John woke up feeling like he hadn't rested at all. He made himself a cup of coffee, hoping the caffeine would shake off the unease from the night before. As he sat at his small dining table, his gaze kept drifting toward the mirror. In the daylight, it seemed harmless, just an antique piece with a bit of a creepy aesthetic. Maybe I should get rid of it, he mumbled to himself. But the idea felt wrong. Like the mirror didn't want to be discarded. Shaking his head, John grabbed his phone and searched for any history on the mirror's origins. But aside from a few listings of similar vintage mirrors, nothing stood out. He considered calling the old shop, but something told him they wouldn't have much to say. As he scrolled through his phone, his reflection in the mirror seemed off. Not distorted. Not monstrous. Just a little too slow. John turned his head sharply to the left. His reflection followed a second too late. His stomach twisted. He lifted his hand, waving at himself. Again, a slight lag. What the hell, he whispered. The air around him felt heavier. He stared hard at the glass, trying to convince himself it was some trick of the light, his tired eyes playing games with him. Then his reflection smiled. John hadn't smiled. His breath caught in his throat. His real face remained frozen in horror, but his mirrored self, that thing in the glass, was grinning at him. The smile widened. Then, slowly, his reflection lifted a single finger, placing it against its lips. SHHH. John stumbled back, knocking over his chair. His phone slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. The mirror returned to normal. His reflection looked exactly as it should, wide-eyed, terrified, mirroring his every move in perfect sync. John's hands trembled. He felt lightheaded, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something else. Something was wrong with that mirror. John didn't go to work that day. Instead, he spent hours researching paranormal phenomena, haunted mirrors, and urban legends. Most of what he found were generic ghost stories, but one thread caught his attention: mirrors as gateways. Some cultures believed mirrors weren't just reflections. They were portals. Some were harmless, merely reflecting our world. But others had been used in rituals, traps for wandering spirits, or worse, things that should never cross over. A cold sweat formed on John's brow. He searched through every online forum he could find, hoping someone might have encountered something similar. But the deeper he dug, the more disturbing the theories became. Some mirrors trap souls. Some mirrors reflect not just present, but the past, or the future. Some mirrors don't show you at all. John pushed away from his laptop, rubbing his temples. This was insane. He was going crazy. But then... knock. 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 The sound echoed from the bedroom. John's stomach dropped. The mirror. He grabbed his phone, hesitating before stepping toward the bedroom door. His fingers hovered over the doorknob. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then, a new sound joined the knocking. Whispering. Low, hushed, urgent. John's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was trying to talk to him. Something inside the mirror. Summoning every ounce of courage, John pushed open the door. The room was cold. Much colder than before. His breath fogged in the air as he stepped inside. The mirror stood exactly where it had been the night before, its surface impossibly dark. He felt like he was staring into an abyss rather than a reflection. He took another step forward. Then, a handprint bloomed on the glass. John's body locked in place. The handprint was on the inside of the mirror. He stumbled back. His entire body screamed at him to run, to get out, to leave this cursed thing behind. But his feet refused to move. Then, the whispering grew louder. Clearer. It was his own voice. John. The whisper came from inside the glass. It was him. Help me. John's blood ran cold. The reflection looking back at him wasn't mimicking his fear anymore. It was desperate. Trapped. Begging. A horrible realization dawned. What if the real John was in there? And the one standing outside was something else. The whispering stopped. John took a shaky breath and reached toward the mirror, fingers hovering just above the surface. The glass paused beneath his fingertips, almost like it was alive. Then, the reflection lunged. John screamed, stumbling back as the mirror cracked with a deafening shatter. Darkness exploded outward. And everything went black. Stay tuned for part 2. Thanks for watching. Kindly subscribe to Arab African Folktales for more interesting videos.